Hello. What if Satine Kryze was a lightsaber? This isn't any ordinary video. Someone won the free lightsaber from our 75,000 subscriber lightsaber giveaway. Let's go, my guys. Let's do it. Let's see who won, and then I have to apologize to you for what you're just about to see. It hurts a lot. And the winner is Juan Pablo Vitali. Congratulations on your free lightsaber. Art Sabers and I will be reaching out to you. Make sure you don't fall for the scam. He is the only winner for this lightsaber giveaway. There will be a new lightsaber giveaway announced in the coming days. Congratulations. Enjoy this video. It's gonna hurt. I'm so sorry. Our story begins in the capital city of Kenobi on Mandalore. The future Duchess of the planet walked with her father. He was the current head of Clan Kryze, and his daughters Satine and Bo were all he had left. Bo wasn't with them, as father and eldest daughter walked to a landing platform. Satine's dad was going to ensure the peace was kept between the clans. There had been peace, but it was teetering on the brink of war. Satine at this point was only 14 years old, and she happily listened to everything her father told her. Much like everyone else in her society, she had training to be a Mandalorian warrior, and being that her family was a ruling family of not just Kalevala, but Mandalore as a whole, she and her sister received some of the best training available in the entire system. Satine stopped and hugged her father goodbye. He told her that he would be back, and when he got back, he'd show her some of the new documents they'd been forming. They were brilliant ideas according to her father. She smiled and waved at him, standing next to two Mandalorian guards stationed to protect her. Satine's father entered the vessel, and within moments the entire landing platform was engulfed in flames. Shock filled the air, and then it was met by terror. Satine was thrown from her feet, and when she looked up, all she could see is debris. In an effort to find her father, she ran forward, but it was to no avail. The guards behind her picked her up and took her back to the facility. Kenobi was under attack. It wasn't just an assassination, the entire city went under. Satine tried piecing together everything that was unfolding in front of her eyes, and yet she couldn't. One of the guards took point, pushing through the corridors and issuing out orders to the rest of the guard to ensure the princess was secure. The following words that came over would haunt Satine for a lifetime, as she learned that her sister sided with the Death Watch. The guard pushed Satine through another hallway, and when she turned her head over, she saw bloodshed inside of her father's throne room. Mandalorians were killing each other. The guard were strong, but they weren't expecting an all-out assault. On their escape from the throne room, the guard that was pushing her from behind was shot in the back. Not dead, but crippled. The other guard got behind the Duchess and made sure that she was protected. Another group of guards piled in through the door, and they got Satine to a shuttle, and she exited the battlefield that was now Kenobi. She was taken back to a major city, that one being Sundari. The capital was lost, and the people here in Sundari were now aware that the Death Watch would no longer stand for peace. War had engulfed the planet once more, and at the helm of power in the government was Duchess Satine, a 14-year-old monarch. How could she orchestrate the survival of her people? The documents her father had mentioned previously had details about their plans to separate the warriors from the people who wanted to progress as a society, which would have put the warriors on Concordia. The truth is, most Mandalorians were on the side of Clan Kryze, renouncing the way of the Mandalore to evolve into a modern galaxy. However, Death Watch held on to the dreams of a dead civilization. Satine had to push past the grief of losing both her father and sister in the span of 24 hours. As a ruler, she couldn't be sat up in her room crying and wishing the world had been kinder to her. She needed to get a grip on the situation, and so she did. This encouraged a number of powerful people across the system and the galaxy to interact with the young Duchess. She was vying for assistance, but planets knew not to cooperate with Mandalore. They were always seen as aggressive warriors, and another civil war only continued that reputation. As Satine took helm over the rule of Mandalore, she only saw how tarnished Mandalore's reputation was and how little respect people had for them. It wasn't misplaced either. There were horror stories of trade routes being engulfed and ripped apart because a Mandalorian started a clash, which turned into a battle and months later turned into an entire system into a civil war. For a planet of only 4 million residents, it was always horrific. Satine had advisors picking and fighting amongst each other to try and have their view for Mandalore pushed to the front of her mind. For a 14-year-old, she wasn't dumb enough to play that game with them. Her father had a mind of his own and made sure that Satine did too. He had to, especially after Satine's mother died. Satine's father must have known that Death Watch was going to get to him at some point or another, and he wanted her to know everything he knew before he died. Sure, she didn't know everything, but now she spent countless hours of sleepless nights picking through memories with her father, trying to remember what he said. It was the stuff of nightmares. She couldn't spend time crying over his death, and instead of rejoicing for the time she had with him, she was picking through the memories of her lessons so that she could save her people from extinction. Satine during this time was given a great deal of distaste for violence, seeing how it could upend a society, rip people away from their families and cause mass exodus away from her planet. No modern planet in this galaxy could survive like this. There were also people trying to get Satine to garner aid from the Republic, but there was a century-old treaty between the Mandalore and the Republic, and she had no intention of breaking that. The work of her grandparents would not be ripped away from her people because of the Death Watch. They were terrorists, and they should be treated as such. Satine allowed a full military occupation to persist, and in a means to garner more supplies for troops, she began reaching out to wealthy bankers across the galaxy. One of these bankers came from a very powerful family that was based off Megiddo. This brought Mun banker Hego Damas II to Sundari to negotiate with Satine. He was surprised that he was rerouted to Sundari, considering it was widely unknown how bad the war got on Mandalore. Out of Mandalore's 4 million people, already 700,000 of them had been killed. The former capital city of Kaldabi was nothing but rubble. Satine saw the streets, footage from frontline warriors, and the sights were horrific. Dead filled the streets, morgues were nothing but alleyways and animals picked apart at the bodies. Something out of a nightmare. But it was reality of the situation. Satine explained to Hego that she needed funding for her people. He needed something out of this. And while he didn't expect an answer, Satine was quick on her feet. Her advisors helped her, but the bags under her eyes and the weakness in her structure told him that in reality she pulled all the all-nighters. Satine told Hego how desperate she was, promising that in 20 years' time the interest on the payments would be paid off tenfold. She just needed her people to survive. For anyone like Hego, this was no-brainer. Surely the Mandalorians would win, at least the ones supporting Satine, so he was all in. However, it wasn't his only reason for supporting Satine. For the Sith, Mandalore was a key world that they had struggled with and against in the past. Having an ally on that planet would be necessary for galactic domination. But the outline of Satine's plan wouldn't just include Mandalore, it would include nearly 1,000 star systems. Satine's research looked like a coalition to rise up against the Republic with, but she simply expressed that she would rebuild relations across the galaxy and prove that Mandalore can be civilized and respected as if it was a part of the core. Hego liked this a lot, though there weren't just financial or political gains with Mandalore. While he and Satine were on a walk through Sundari, he could feel something within Satine. She was powerful with the Force and it radiated off of her. Though it wasn't something an inexperienced Force user would be able to recognize. It took hours for Hego to recognize and realize, and it took hours more for him to even confirm it. For someone of Satine's age, it could take a long time to figure out, or maybe they wouldn't even figure it out at all. While they were on their walk, finalizing their plans, a skirmish broke out, and they were rushed back to the palace. Their deals were finalized, and Hego left with the promise of a stronger Mandalore. One of Satine's advisors told her that she should get a group of Jedi here to protect her, to get out of the city for a short period of time to protect herself. This particular advisor wanted her to be safe as she could be. As long as she survived, Mandalore survived, and he knew that. If she died here in the capital, then all would be lost for future generations. She appreciated the sentiment, but refused. Her birthday came around, and when it did, she was locked in a bunker, under the hellfire of Mandalorian weaponry. It was after her terribly sad birthday in which she requested 2 Jedi Knights to come to her aid. The Jedi Master, Qui-Gon Jinn, noticed a twitch of the Force, but didn't have time to focus on it. He instead insisted that Obi Wan Kenobi, his Jedi Padawan, take Satine off-world to one of Mandalore's moons for some time. She and Obi-Wan had to get acquainted fast, because she was now reliant on him solely for her protection from Mandalorian bounty hunters. You know, the ones who train entire lifetimes to be able to kill anyone, including Jedi. Not that a Jedi Padawan would be problematic for any of them. While this endeavor was started, what they hoped to be at the end of the war wouldn't come for another year. How sweet it was to have someone your own age with you. Both Satine and Obi-Wan were the same age, with Obi-Wan being maybe a couple months older than her. They had to rely on each other and protect each other. It started off really basic, keeping at arm's length of distance from each other. By the middle of the excursion, they were walking shoulder to shoulder, sleeping with their heads leaned against the others. To Satine, it was a simple romance she read in kids' novels, or the stories that were told to her by her mother about duchesses and dukes. How nice it would be if Obi-Wan wasn't just a Jedi. Duke Kenobi had a better ring to it. Sometimes she would play the name game when he was sleeping. They took watches at night just to be safe. Even Satine had a weapon to defend herself in case they were discovered. The name Satine would play with is how their names would sound together, the typical thing a girl might do if she fancied someone. Satine Kenobi, Obi Wan Kryze, Satine Kenobi Kryze, any and all of them. She couldn't help but ponder over it for hours, or other times it would just be her reflecting on peaceful moments between the two of them. You know, the moments, the brief eye contact or the holding of hands when a twig snapped. It was very quaint to say the least. By the end of their journey with each other, they had definitely caught feelings for the other, but none of them said it. For Satine, it was very difficult. She, at least according to the stories her mother told her, felt like she was in love. But Obi Wan was a Jedi. He'd been caring towards her and maybe even a bit empathetic towards her, but she wasn't sure if it was just kindness or genuine affection. The two of them were in a bind here. Minutes before Obi Wan was whisked away back to Coruscant, they had a chance to share their feelings for each other. Obi Wan would leave the Order if Satine said the word, but she loved him too much to take him away from something he obviously loved. They talked, and as they talked, she learned how much Obi Wan cared about the Jedi Order, or as she liked to call him, Ben. She was afraid that if she told him her true feelings, then he'd either reject her or leave the Order. It was a lose-lose situation because she loved him, but if he denied her, then her heart would shatter. If he joined her, then he would lose something he loved. So was the tragedy of not communicating such feelings. The two of them went their separate ways after a short, brief but magical hug. Both of them thought about what it could mean to say goodbye to the other. For how long? Neither knew. Satine returned to her work as a Duchess of Mandalore and picked up right where she left off, in the ruins of her planet. Sundari was a wasteland. The worst part is, Mandalore itself was a very unstable world, so it's not just like people could just go and live their lives outside the cities. The death count of the war reached into 2 million, with the former capital nothing but rubble and families torn apart. The Death Watch was on the loose, but they were banished from Mandalore to the moon of Concordia. They were nothing but a group of isolated individuals. The hope is that they would either learn their ways or tear each other apart. Satine didn't want any more violence on her hands, and she couldn't stand the idea of forcing these rambunctious children to grow up. It was time for their way to come to an end. When she returned to her palace, she put her Mandalorian armor in the closet and said goodbye to all of her weapons, even the one weapon that her mother gave her. She kept the defibrillator with her, and that's all she needed for self-defense. As a warrior, she could defend herself if it came to it, but there was no reason to flaunt weaponry or armor to hurt people. Considering she was now reliant on funds from Damask Holdings, Hega was spending a lot more time on Mandalore and inside of Sundari. The wealthy banker had returned and saw the rubble that Satine found herself in. Something about her, aside from her natural affinity for the Force, interested him. She was something special, and he couldn't neglect to foster her growth into a Sith Lord. Hega Damask II was secretly Lord Plagueis the Wise. He had himself a pupil and an assassin. Could a backup plan hurt? Plagueis was well aware of the fact that Satine spent a full year with a Jedi, but he seemingly didn't pick up on it. The irony of that being that Obi Wan likely thought it was a falling in love chemical rather than the Force itself. Plagueis thought it to be so funny because the undoing of the Jedi would be in their inability to pick up on the Force within someone, mistaking it for emotions. Satine was by no means a Palpatine. He was something else, a very powerful Sith Lord, someone who could rival that of Mother Talzin and Yoda. Satine, on the other hand, was much closer to Plagueis and a little higher than Maul. She'd be a fine student. However, he couldn't just twist her into a Sith without giving her a reason to do so. He needed to give her an allure to be his ally. So he began weaving his way through her mind with simple tips and tricks, building a trust between the two of them and lending her more money than she knew what to do with. He told her that he felt bad for her cause, and while Satine wasn't greedy by any means, she took the credits. All the money she received went into funding projects for her citizens, giving them access things they no longer had. However, what impressed Plagueis the most was the fact that Satine couldn't be bought. She was someone who needed to have trust with someone. Credits wouldn't suffice. Being that she was a young woman, she already believed the odds were working against her, especially when her age was taken into consideration. Hega knew how to approach this, and he informed her that he could get her into rooms with politicians of neighboring star systems. There was plenty that he could do to assist her, and she was grateful, but she often wondered what the catch was. The irony being is that there was no catch. She was already providing to a plan that Plagueis had been concocting ever since he first learned of her sensitivity to the Force. Part of him believed that Palpatine would make a move against him whenever he achieved more power. Being that she was just a senator for Naboo, more power could only come from the role of Chancellor, but that was years away even in Plagueis' mind. After a year of helping Satine, he asked her what she knew of the Force. By this point, Sundari had been rebuilt into a pristine condition. Refugees from the war had homes, children had therapists and schooling, no one was starving. Satine rebuilt a fractured system, and it couldn't be overstated that money didn't buy this. Leadership did. Satine refused to eat better food than her people. She didn't stay in the palace because the palace was inhabitable. It was the very last thing in the city to be restored, despite what people said about it. For a 17-year-old, she captured the hearts of her people. She was their Duchess, and they loved her for what she did in such a short period of time. Satine began to crack down on militaristic obsessions and inform individuals that while they can keep family relics and armor, it was not to be worn or used outside of their homes. No individual would be permitted to buy or sell them. The only individuals who had access to weaponry inside of Sundari was the royal guard and the police force. Aside from them, it was a cleansing of the warrior history. It hurt Satine to do this in her own way. She knew her father would have wanted the warrior way to stay and be remembered, but it wasn't worth the damage it caused. Satine herself wore earrings of the tusks of the ancient mythosaur just to remember her past. It wasn't just the buildings that were destroyed, but it was the trauma that sat within the people. The answer Satine gave to Plagueis was a little confused, especially since she had spent a year with the Jedi. She knew what the Force was, and she knew that Obi Wan used it, but didn't exactly have much else to offer about that. He asked her if she believed she had the Force or not. Satine thought it was goofing around with her, and so she denied. She wasn't a Force user. Plagueis told her that he had a midichlorian sampler if she wanted to try it out. She told him she had no interest in it. However, she would try it for fun, as long as the results stayed between the two of them. Why would Hego demand otherwise? He even made a pinky promise with her, so no one breaks those. When the results came back, he wasn't at all surprised. She was right below him with a count of 14,800. Plagueis, for reference, had a count of 15,500. Satine was shocked, almost panicked. She told Hego that she didn't want to go to the Jedi Order. She had to serve her people, telling him that no one could find out. Hego laughed it off, telling her that she was much too old to be brought to the Jedi Order. She didn't know, but she was 17. She was only 14 years too late. However, Plagueis told her that he knew how to use the Force, which she didn't really have any issues with. Maybe he left the Jedi Order. She simply asked why he wasn't a Jedi, and he simply told her that it didn't align with his beliefs, suggesting that the Jedi were far too political. She understood where he was coming from, but the two Jedi she was with weren't political at all. Maybe they would change. This is where Plagueis realized he needed to tread delicately. She had a foundational respect for the Jedi, so he would twist it ever so delicately. He had time. He was a Sith Lord. They were built to be patient, so he would make sure this young Duchess would be one of his finest assets. The Sith Lord didn't address his interest in the Force, only telling her and showing her how to use it. While he may have played it simple and cool, he was really doing something else here. He was giving her the basic instructions for how to use the dark side of the Force. It was just presented in a way as if a Jedi would use it. He showed her simple tricks, and then when he left, he gave her a holocron, telling her that he understood she didn't have massive interest in the Force or anything, but this holocron could give her more information whenever she wanted. Satine was very appreciative, but she didn't really care much for it, leaving it in her closet for whenever she had some free time. As a Mandalorian Force user, she was the first of her kind seen in generations. It was a miracle she wasn't discovered by the Jedi. One could only imagine what would happen to her people if she became a Jedi. Satine forgot about the hologram for the most part. She often meditated in a therapeutic way in the morning and in the evening just to assist her mind therapeutically. She was under a lot of duress with no personal support. She had friends, but not close friends. She was a leader, and as they say, it's lonely on top. Satine spent a lot of time coming to terms with her predicament, many nights wishing and hoping that Obi Wan could be with her. It'd be nice to have Ben by her side. It felt like he understood her. He always listened. That was the least anyone nowadays could do. During Satine's meditations, she would use the Force lightly, enough to keep it in her mind like muscle memory. This was secretly extremely beneficial. The reason for being so is that she was allowing her body and mind to become one with the Force without realizing it. Essentially, for a Force user, it would permit her to become more powerful over time, refining her abilities and allowing her to do more with less. While her midichlorian count was nothing to scoff at, refining that count would at least give her the advantage and the ability to stand up to the avatars in the Force, such as Yoda, Sidious, or Mother Talzin. She didn't know this, and she didn't care about it. She just saw the Force as an extension of herself, allowing her to be more intuitive. This led her to removing Prime Minister Almec from her administration, foreseeing that he would likely be a leash to what she already wanted to create. He was a traitor in her colors, and she would not stand for that, because it would stunt the growth for her people. Satine used the Force more and more over the years, but it never became something she was too focused on. She did get significantly better at it, and each time Plagueis came around, he would ask her about the holocron and how far along she was going along. At this point, Hego was the closest person to Satine, and so she treated him like she would treat an uncle or an extended family member. Close, but not super duper close. However, Hego could feel that Satine felt alone, and so he became a shoulder to cry on when she needed it. She was strong, but there was only so much an individual could handle on their own. And not for nothing, years at the pinnacle of power after a catastrophic civil war was very isolating. She didn't intentionally do it, but her duties required her to do it. Satine had to travel across the galaxy several times. Most of the time, she wasn't even in her own palace after it was finally finished. There was a reason for this. She was bringing politicians, senators, business corporations, and just about anyone else she could wrangle to Mandalore. By doing this, she was beginning to expand trust out across the mid and outer rim. Systems surrounding Mandalore had their faith renewed, not in Mandalore as a whole, but in their leadership. Satine was a fine politician. Hego even debated if she was a better politician than Palpatine. She clearly had more under her belt at a younger age. This made Hego reconsider Palpatine's usefulness. While Sidious was a powerful asset and very wise, he was too powerful for Plagueis' own good. If Sidious got a handle on power, he would likely turn on him. However, Satine would be much more fitting of a pupil for him. She was bright, brilliant, and seemingly on top of her game all the time. The only issue was her lack of interest in the Force. For the next couple years, Satine would be up to her head in stress, and then eventually, in 32 BBY, she learned that her friend Hego Damas II had disappeared. She worried about him, but he had just fallen off the face of the galactic map. This really hurt her heart. He'd been her only friend, the closest friend for nearly a decade, and the closest thing to family that she had, aside from Bo, who she never saw. Satine's heart was rattled and slightly broken. The role of leadership was hard, and aside from her therapeutic meditations, she had no one. It reminded her of the holocron. She didn't really have an interest in what it could give to her, but the moment she opened it, she was consumed with this manipulative curse. The holocron, being a Sith holocron, knew how to lock on to those who used it. The purpose was to lure you in and keep you grounded. If it could, at the very least, do that, then resisting the dark side would be that much harder. And since Satine didn't crave power or strength, it gave her peace. The power of the dark side filled her up, and she was able to soothe herself with everything that left her hopeless and chronically alone. The holocron gave her a friend, the friendship, the family she lacked. Satine looked to the holocron, and then she used it more and more frequently than she would have ever imagined. Each time she opened it up, she thought she was receiving peace and comfort, when in reality, it was filling her mind and body with more and more power. This was remarkable. About a week after the disappearance of Hego, she received a box. Inside the box was a lightsaber. It was beautifully crafted. She twisted it in her hand and smiled at it. She knew what it was, and then she looked into the box and saw a note. She read it over. The gist said that Hego was falling ill and he didn't want to worry her. He told her that she had done well and that he was very proud of her. He crafted this lightsaber for her. She would know how and when to use it. Satine fell in her room. She held the lightsaber as tears streamed from her face. It hurt so bad to be alone again. It pained her. She wiped the tears away from her eyes, and then she held the weapon in front of her and ignited the weapon. The crimson glow showered her in red, and she looked at it before deigniting the weapon and wondering why he never told her he was sick. She spent the rest of the day pent up in her room, crying, not sure who to be angry at, or if it was even fair to be angry. One thing was for sure, her emotions were out of whack. Satine, after a day of mourning, would return to her normal business. She would continue to drum up positivity around Mandalore, learning of the election of Chancellor Palpatine. She and Hego talked about it a couple times, and she had no real interest in playing the game Palpatine played. She had no clue about him being a Sith Lord. More so, she was just uninterested in him as a person. His policies weren't exactly her favorite. Years would begin to pass by. Satine would play with her lightsaber from time to time and learn more information from the holocron. Something she never knew or realized is that the holocron was Plagueis' personal holocron. He made it and outfitted it with every single lesson he believed would work well for Satine. He was very right. The focus on the Force and emotional strength allowed her to become what the Sith might call a nightmare. She was now very powerful with the Force, and she barely realized it. All she knew is she could use the Force and wield a lightsaber. All of her Mandalorian training prepared her to wield a lightsaber anyways. It was taught to her by her father. He, of course, was hoping that he could win the Darksaber from Clan Vizsla, but of course, they never liked to play nice. They were always cheaters, and he never liked them. In Satine's father's mind, they didn't even deserve to be Mandalorians, let alone have a Darksaber passed down to them. He almost challenged Pre-Vizsla's father, but Satine was being born, so he left it alone. All this meaning that Satine knew how the energy within the blade worked. She knew how to use a lightsaber efficiently, and there was not a doubt in her mind that she could whip it out if she ever was in danger. However, she never carried it with her. It wasn't something that she could just walk around with. Eventually, the Clone Wars would jump into full fire, and she'd have a chance to reunite with Obi Wan. Though she wasn't exactly excited for his arrival. She was under the belief that he was only being sent here because of the Senate. By this time, Satine's hard work paid off. She now ran the Neutral System Coalition of a grouping of 1,500 star systems. This was built up after the Civil War ended, and because Satine restored trust in the people, she was able to garner support and recognition amongst other neutral systems. Mandalore became the beacon of neutrality in the Clone Wars, and Plennis fled to Satine's side. The short stint with Obi Wan would be genuinely nice. Obi-Wan noticed a difference about her, but again chalked it up to the fact that she was under stress. The Republic was pressuring her to join, and she refused amid assassination attempts and public bombings to denounce her name. Satine didn't buckle. She was a Kryze, and they didn't bend to anyone. Obi-Wan respected this, and he stuck by her side through the entire ordeal, but again, leaving her to serve the Jedi, and sending her back to Sundari alone. This didn't really destroy Satine as it had the first time. She was certainly upset, wishing he would do as he said. She told him how she felt, and he said he would have left the Jedi Order, but he didn't after she told him how she really felt. It left a sour taste in her mouth for the two of them. Both of them wanting to have a moment with the other again. Another gentle, intimate moment. Just the two of them holding hands or sitting next to each other with their shoulders overlapped. Just something so simple, but never the chance. At least Satine had the holocron. It gave her some sense of comfort. That comfort wouldn't last more than a year when Mandalore was ransacked by pirates. She knew that she could fight, but there was no point in sacrificing her planet's status over a civil war. She had a plan, and she was waiting for everything to play out as her mind envisioned. Maybe the holocron was getting to her, or maybe it was just that she was tired of having to be a martyr for her people. She did so much, and it all came crashing down on her. She didn't play the hero. Instead, she surrendered herself over, with the belief that her people would revolt once Maul betrayed Pre Vizsla. She knew what happened, and not more than 24 hours after the hostile takeover, Vizsla was executed in Satine's throne room. She'd be brought back to it once it was discovered that Obi Wan was here to rescue her. This was a slight change of plans for Satine, but she could make it work. Maul intended on torturing Obi Wan, making him suffer in his pain, but Satine didn't quite see it that way. Maul attempted to force choke Satine, but that didn't work. That's odd. Maul turned around with confusion in his mind when a ripple of force electricity bounced off the floor and into his eyes. Satine was amazed in herself. She didn't realize she had that in her. Maul fell backwards with his hands covering his eyes, rubbing at them ferociously. Savage ignited his lightsaber, but Obi-Wan shoved himself forward, releasing a force push that threw Savage through the panel window behind the chair. Satine got up and used the force to lift the men into the ceiling as Obi-Wan confusedly got her hand and ran with her. The two of them avoided the Mandalorians as they made their way back to an exit that came out of Satine's room. She only knew about it. As they made their way there, Satine grabbed her lightsaber and they snuck into the room, lowering the door. Satine told Obi-Wan that they should run away, together. He looked at her, confusion across his face and sadness in his eyes. How did he not realize she could use the Force? Satine picked up on the sadness, and her heart began to break from the inside out. Was it her? What was so wrong about her? Obi-Wan told her that he couldn't. He couldn't just run away with her. She asked why, and he told her that she wasn't acting like herself. She didn't seem right. Obi-Wan grabbed her hand and asked her how she learned how to use such powers. Satine's demeanor changed. The hopeful joy faded into a disappointed scowl. She looked into Obi-Wan's eyes and asked if he truly loved her. He nodded his head, and then he said the word, but. He continued his statement telling her that she wasn't the woman he fell in love with. Satine choked on air. She leaned back against the wall, almost in tears. She asked why he would say that. He told her that she was using the dark side. She was going to run away from her people. She had a lightsaber? What was all this about? He held her hand tight, but her grip loosened and loosened. She let go, and turned her head away. She apologized for bringing him here. She wiped a tear from her eyes and made her way for the door that they entered. Obi-Wan grabbed her wrist. He told her that he wouldn't leave without her. She then asked why wouldn't he come with her and run away with her. He told Satine that despite his love for her, he had a duty to the Republic, as she did for her people. He wanted nothing more for her to be happy, but he was a Jedi. That's where his mandate was. Satine ripped her hand from his grip and told him that her family's castle would be the best place to find her, if he decided to come back to her, that is. Otherwise, if her using her natural gifts were too much for his code and his beliefs, then maybe it was time to say goodbye. Obi-Wan shook his head, walking up the steps behind her, pleading that she don't leave. They could discuss this in a safer place. Satine turned her head around, and Obi-Wan could not just see, but he could feel the presence of the dark side. He held out his hand, trying to plead with her, trying to get her to understand that he wanted to help. Satine asked what was so wrong with what she used, what was so wrong about who she was. All she wanted to do was be with him. She allowed the pirates to overtake Mandalore. She was going to give everything up so that she could have him. Didn't he understand that? Obi-Wan shook his head, that he didn't want it at the expense of her people. She asked when it was their turn. She dedicated her entire life to Mandalore. When was it her turn to get a break? Obi-Wan dedicated his entire life to the Jedi, who couldn't maintain the peace. When was it his turn? Obi-Wan shook his head, trying to defend the Jedi, but before he could mount up his defense, she opened the door and turned back to look at him. A tear sat under his eyelid. A lump sat in his throat. He tried to speak, but the door closed on him. Satine turned around and slid down the side of the door with her hands on her face. Obi-Wan did the same, falling up the stairs, reaching towards his face and covering his mouth, as to make his cries inaudible. He wanted to be with her, but maybe he couldn't be. What was pulling them apart? The same painful thoughts itched at her. In the corner of the room, a crimson glow shined, and Satine looked through her watery eyes at the holocron. She got up and grabbed it. Obi Wan, on the other hand, made his way down the stairs and abandoned Mandalore. Both of them, the star-crossed lovers, were broken inside their hearts. This separation was the most painful of all of them. It ended in an argument rather than a show of affection, and now they both had to live with the last words they said to each other. Satine pondered on what Obi Wan would have said had she left the gate open, Obi Wan wishing he could have selected different words, or said to her what he needed to say before she closed the door, or what he wanted to say other than what he did say. Maybe Anakin's mentality was right, maybe the code was wrong for him. Never in his life did Obi Wan question the Jedi code so much. Satine, on the other hand, grabbed the crystal, and before leaving, heard the sound of lightsabers. She felt a dark presence, and when she rounded the corner, she found Maul and Savage in gridlock, with another being. Satine could feel it. It was Palpatine. Only that man had such a dark energy. She felt into the seething darkness, and then she caught a glimpse of his side profile. It was indeed the Chancellor. How interesting. The words Plagueis said to her now sat in the forefront of her mind. Surely she could manipulate the situation into her favor. She took her weapon and the holocron and made her way to the Kryze castle on Kalvala. It was a peaceful estate, but on the estate there was no peace. Her parents, dead. Her planet in civil war. Her sister, a traitor, and her love was no longer seemingly interested. A heart broken can only mend itself, but Satine decided that a broken heart can only be mended by the dark side, and so she devoted herself to the dark side of the Force. It broke her spirit and her heart, but those broken feelings were uplifted when the dark side rolled into her, and she felt the power that she always deserved. Satine spent this time to herself rummaging through the dark arts, and as the Republic fell, so did the light. Sidious was completely unaware of a Sith Duchess. However, she was very aware of him and his new pupil. Satine spent a lot of time searching through the Force, and because she was experimenting with the limits of the holocron, she found herself Vader, a very vulnerable Darth Vader, not even a year into his armor, already thinking about destroying his master, and then it clicked for Satine. Clearly Kenobi wouldn't be coming back to her, so why not make sure she had herself a future? She began to dig into Vader, not allowing her presence to be felt. She could hear Vader toiling over Padme's death. It was repetitive, over and over again, wondering why. Oh, she could play with this, and so she did. Satine manipulated the sound of her voice through the Force and began messing with Vader. Vader was helpless. He was set up in a bacta tank, left to suffer through his failure, and thanks to Obi Wan, he didn't. How interesting, Satine thought to herself as she began playing with the helpless remnant of Anakin Skywalker. All Vader could hear is Padme telling him to make up for his mistakes, to destroy his master for putting him through this. Satine and Padme were friends, so not for nothing she was getting back at both Sidious and Vader for causing her death. She continued to pry at him. She could feel his anger growing, and she played off of it. She felt so brilliant. Satine took her time with this, though. She had no issue playing the long game. Of course, as everything was going well, she got an unexpected visitor. She initially thought it to be Obi Wan, but it wasn't. It was her sister, Bo-Katan. Bo didn't realize her sister was still alive and came back to Kalvala to see her family's castle once more. She was shocked to say the least, and she was really excited to see her sister. Bo was really upset when she thought Satine died. It was her sister's death that cleared her mind and woke her up to the atrocities of Death Watch. Satine just sat on her throne. It looked different. The entire aesthetic to the castle was a bit more gloomy, and Satine just let her sister get her last words out. Yeah, her last words. When Bo was done, she walked up to her sister with her arms open, looking to receive a hug, and Satine got up and opened her arms. As her sister got closer, a lightsaber slid down the sleeve and ignited. Bo couldn't react fast enough. Before Satine knew it, her sister's head was rolling on the ground. What a nice way to say hi to someone she once held so near and dear. Satine wasn't keeping any loose ends. She continued to mess with Vader. He was slowly losing his mind because at first it felt like he was having mind games played on him. Now he was fully convinced that Padme was still alive or within the Force or something. It really was a cruel trick. Anakin thought his wife was calling to him when in reality, she was not. By doing this, she learned everything about not just Anakin, but the events that led to the man in the bacta tank. She learned about its defeat at Mustafar, the Jedi falling apart, Sidious, and of course one crucial thing, Vader's weakness. Though it wouldn't be the last time Satine had unexpected visitors. About a month later, she would have a visit from her dearly beloved. He changed his name to Ben so no one would recognize him, and using that name only brought him pain. He came out here to reconcile with Satine, maybe bring her back, or even give Luke a safe space to call home with her. He wished he thought about it, but Yoda suggested otherwise. Obi-Wan really struggled after their last encounter. He partially blamed himself for everything, but he also couldn't sleep with the thought of her feeling and being alone. It haunted him till the end of the war, and he let his position on the council blind him to his own feelings. He thought they could win the war and he could come to Kalevala and be here for her, but that just wasn't the case. He felt wrong for it and spent so much time on his own, worrying about her, but also drowning in sorrow of what happened to Anakin. For Obi-Wan, he couldn't fail someone else he loved. He didn't have it in his heart to fail Satine, so he came here to make things right. Satine was very noticeably different. She no longer wore Duchess gowns, and she now wore a black cloak. When he entered the castle, he walked along the corridors in silence until he turned the corner and looked down the hallway to see her. She sat silently looking back at him. He noticed the difference immediately, and continued until she just raised her hand at him. He stopped and asked her for a moment to talk. She could feel her eyes twitch. The tears wanted to come, but she forced them back down. She asked what he wanted, with a croak in her voice. He reached out his hand and told her that he wanted to make things right. She simply looked at him. Obi-Wan stepped forward a little more and told her that he didn't mean to make her feel guilty for using the Force in a way that she was naturally drawn to. He didn't mean to chastise her for wanting something for her own. Satine tilted her head ever so slightly, looking at Obi-Wan. She looked at the ground and his voice faded in and out of coherence. Some of it was audible, the rest it sounded like it was housed in the seas. Satine looked back up. She made a decision before he could even finish. She let him ramble on his little desperate apology, and then he said the words, "Stay with me. Don't leave again." Satine's eyes watered. He didn't have to say that, but he did. She was sold on her decision. She stood up and stepped forward towards him and asked that he take a walk with her. He nodded his head, and the two of them locked their hands around the others. They walked to the edge of the castle and sat down, looking at the ship he flew on. It wasn't much, but he told her it was the only thing he could afford and the only thing that would get from Tatooine to Kalevala. Satine hung her legs over the edge, and Obi-Wan got down next to her and told her how much he missed her. She spoke in agreement as she gently placed her head on his shoulder. Satine asked Obi-Wan about what happened, and he explained it all to her. He continued and continued, telling her about Anakin's children. Satine listened with great intent, and kept allowing him to tell her about everything. And then he persisted to ask about her, and she simply told him that she was struggling with solitude again. She learned that her sister died in Sundari, and without a leader or the dark saber, the people of Mandalore were thrusted back in the war. He told her how sorry he was for her people, and she just nodded her head. For the rest of the day and the night, they would spend time with each other, inseparable just like they were eons ago, during that one year when they were kids. Everything was going well, no signs of bad omens, and both Satine and Obi-Wan were very happy with each other. He showed a lot of interest in what she could do with the Force, and she told him it was simple, expressing that what had happened in her throne room was nothing but an accident. About a week after Obi-Wan landed on Kalevala, he got an emergency distress signal from Bail Organa. Obi-Wan didn't see the 3 messages for another couple days, but when he saw it, he learned that the Emperor was assassinated. The message after that was that Bail Organa needed help. The final message was a transmission that was audible. It was Bail Organa trying to usher Breya out of their palace, and the sound of a lightsaber could be heard, metallic breathing, and then Bail said that Vader was here. Obi-Wan dropped the communication and fell to his knees. How was any of this possible? Satine saw Obi-Wan on the floor in her castle and ran to his side and comforted him, asking what was wrong. He told her that everything was wrong. His breath got unsteady and his body began to tremble, and she came to his aid. He may have not been able to do that for her when she needed it, but she could do it for him, now. Satine held Obi-Wan and told him that it would be okay, and then he thought about the boy. He told Satine that he would be back, and so he left. Satine sat on her throne without moving for an entire 34 hours. She simply sat in a state of peace, closing down her mind and her body to wait for her love to return. When he returned, she showed nothing but excitement for his return, but he was desperately hurt. Luke had been taken and the Lars family was executed by a lightsaber. Satine asked what this could mean, and so she insisted that they do something about this, but Obi-Wan didn't know what they could do. She told Obi-Wan that they get the twins and raise them here on Kalevala together. Of course, Obi-Wan could deny her enthusiasm. He would do it as long as she was by his side. She promised to be by his side until the very end. He appreciated her, When he was on Tatooine, he grabbed his lightsaber and he told her that they'd be going to Coruscant. It's the only place that made sense. She grabbed his hand and told him they would be going, and he smiled. But he was very cautious about bringing her. She neglected his cautious demeanor and told him that she was going with him or they were not going at all. He agreed, and the two of them made their way for Coruscant. With the Emperor dead, everything changed. But not just everything, the ruler was too. Mas Amedda was dead and Vader was reigning over a very fragile system. With Bail Organa dead, one of the prominent voices in the Senate, Vader showed his strength with his power. He took over Padme's former residence and got the kids there. But when he did, he stopped hearing from Padme's voice. Vader only assumed that it was because he made his wife happy. He came to the conclusion that he gave her some sense of peace in the afterlife. And as he came to such a conclusion, he turned to see Obi Wan and Satine. Obi Wan neglected to wonder how or why. Satine knew how to get there. But he was in a rush. Vader hadn't fought with his suit, and the only reason he killed Palpatine was because he killed him in his sleep. Ironic. Satine watched Obi Wan and Vader begin a new lightsaber duel. Obi-Wan's one intention was to get the children and keep them safe. That was Satine's directive, and so she did. Obi-Wan and Vader continued their fight, but it wasn't much of a contest. Sure, Obi-Wan hadn't used a blade since almost a year ago, but it was nothing compared to using a suit that weighed twice your body weight and using hands and legs that were not yours. Vader struggled and Obi-Wan cut him down. Satine rounded the corner as Obi-Wan slashed Vader across the chest. The Dark Lord was laying on the ground, but his breathing got heavier. Obi-Wan turned his head and asked if the children were alright. Satine simply smiled and said, "They were sleeping." A lightsaber ignited into the back of Obi-Wan. She finished her statement. They were sleeping. Eternally. Obi-Wan's eyes shot open and pain slipped through his body. He asked why. All she could say is, "I'm sorry, my dear Obi-Wan. I loved you always." Obi-Wan fell to the ground, his knees buckling beneath him. She didn't love him anymore. She didn't care about him anymore. His eyes got foggy, but as he lay on the ground looking at his brother next to him, he watched as her blade was driven through Vader, killing him too. Satine turned back. Obi-Wan was grasping onto his final breaths. She stood over him, watching, feeling his body go cold. She didn't just feel his body go cold, she felt every emotion he put her through over the last 20 years. Pure infatuation turned into a sense of betrayal, and then what followed was the incurable heartbreak. Satine knelt down. Her presence was icy, cold, but Obi-Wan would have loved nothing more than to hold her hand in these final moments, and she tiptoed her hand away from him. His eyes locked onto it, reaching for her, but she pulled it away, just like every chance for something to grow taken away before it slowly died out. Satine shook her head before making her way to the speeder. When she sat down, she could feel Obi-Wan's last breath. It was cold, silent, alone, and painfully a waste of time, just like everything they'd been through together, only to be sealed off by a tender kiss of her crimson lightsaber. Satine sat on the ship for a moment. Silence filled the air. Not a sound could be heard. She simply accepted the reality and the gravity of what she had done. She gave him the hope that he gave her, except when he ripped it away from her, she died internally. When she pulled it away from him, he tried to get it back, but nothing would ever be given. She sped off away from the murder of the former senator's residence. Satine made her way for the Imperial Senate building, where she interrupted a session of the Senate, rising up in the former vizier of the Empire's spot. She took over the session and informed all of them that Vader was no more. She had him killed for committing crimes against the Empire, being that Vader was nothing more than a former Jedi Knight named Anakin Skywalker. Satine twisted the fate of the Senate into her control. She didn't stop there, though. She told the Senate that she'd be taking over control of the Empire effective immediately. They all looked at each other, questioning how this was at all possible. She used her brilliance in politics to manipulate the session into seeing what had become of the Empire and the Republic under Palpatine. War and a dysfunctional system. She then proved what she had done on Mandalore, and with it proved, she suggested, no. She told the Imperial Senate that she was taking control to establish strength in the Empire. No more Palpatine, no more Vader. Their games were over, and there was now an Empress. It was her. Questions rang in, but all she said was that challengers to her new regime will be dismantled as Vader was. He was a traitor, and Palpatine was a fool for trusting him. Outrage broke, but she vanished into the building. The Imperial Senate would bubble up and spew out at each other, but their focus on debates with each other allowed Satine to sneak into their system, untouched, and take control. It also didn't matter what the Senate thought. She was the Empress. What mattered was what Imperial officers thought, and with most of them being suck-ups, it was very easy to convince them to serve her cause. She would use fresh competition as a means to reduce the Imperial military structure to nothing but pure loyalty. How so? She ensured that officers were busy trying to overthrow each other so that they wouldn't even pay attention to her. This was her brilliance. She would allow everyone and anyone with any sort of power to become too afraid to have so much power they worried about who was below them rather than who was above them. This carried on through the ranks. Plus, she had the clones, who with Order 66 playing cat and mouse in their minds, were already docile enough to encourage following orders. Not to mention, she suggested revenge for Kamino, allowing the clones to take officer positions away from Imperial human hires. This wasn't the only surprise for Satine. About a month and a half after she became Empress, she learned she had a child. She kind of anticipated it. Why else would she allow Obi Wan back into her life? She needed an heir to the throne, and Skywalker's children were not that. Just to put a cherry on top, her son would be named Ben Kenobi Kryze. She did love Obi Wan, somewhere in her heart she did. However, there was two choices. Power or him? She chose power because it's the only thing that ever did give back. Satine's rule would take over where Palpatine could not. Her lack of interest in super weapons and her ability to diligently create unison between the Outer Rim and Mid-Rim worlds were unheard of. While she was most certainly a Sith, she was not dumb. Ruling with an iron fist got no one anywhere. She instead gave people something to root for, and just like any good system of governance, she would rip it out of their hands and blame someone else. She was cynical, because she mastered the art of politics. While she never showed any of this on Mandalore as Empress, she made senators look guilty, which only allowed her to rip apart the Imperial Senate a year after her hostile takeover. Just for good measure, she would create an ISB and create problems on problematic worlds. Onderon, for example, where Saul Gerrera and his rebels were, had a crippling drought. She blamed it on the rebels and then set up a forest fire and burned the rebels right out of their little hideout. And then they were publicly executed. Satine swooped down like an angel to ensure the people of Onderon were taken care of. Their loyalty in her more true than it could ever be. She did this everywhere. She would start a species war on a planet like Naboo, give the Gungans a reason to fight the Naboo, and then once it looked terrible, the Empire would stop them, help them rebuild. It wasn't a perfect system, but it made people loyal. The Imperial military was used to rip criminal empires apart in the Outer Rim. If anyone was having slaves in the galaxy, it wasn't the crime lords, it was the Empire. Satine taught all of this to her young son. Ben took everything his mother told him to his heart and began to see everyone as lesser to him. The only love he shared was with his mother, and the only little tidbit of love Satine had in her broken heart was given to her boy. The hunt for the Jedi would continue for another 12 years. By the end of all that was left a number of Force-sensitive beings and Yoda. The hope for the Jedi was extinguished. Every rebel cell, on the other hand, had crumbled within months of its first appearance, and the longevity of Satine's empire was established, with the heir to her throne becoming just as cynical as her. She may have not orchestrated it, but why do all the work when someone else can do it for you? Ben learned how to manipulate the people into loyalty, and so he would continue his mother's legacy after he became emperor. For a young Sith Lord, he would have many heirs and just as many mistresses, so that the evil lineage of the Sith lasted through the Kenobi Kryze bloodline. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that was something. Special thanks to Galva Gaming, Tristan, Darth Revan, Pimp Daddy Bane, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Jedi Sloth, Mad Matty Studios, Anakin003, Jack Miller, Flanbassis, Lemon Knight, Rex the Wolf, The Man with Three First Names, Dark Saint 46, Lord Deadwing, for supporting the channel. If you want to support me in other ways, check out the Patreon. Otherwise, I'm so sorry. I am, but I'm not. What did we just do? What just happened? Let's talk about the story real quick, because I need to go to therapy after this, and I think I'm sorry I'm not sorry, because I'm happy with where the story came out. I think this story is one of those videos where you're gonna have to watch it a couple of times, because now that the ending is revealed, now that you have the whole story that Satine was kind of just using Obi Wan for an heir at the end of the story, it's just like you're gonna catch some minor details that I sprinkled in there, like a psycho that you probably didn't notice the first time around. And I can't wait to see your guys' reaction to this, because like this story is very intertwined and it's set up so that the ending doesn't feel forced, but it feels really natural. I really wanted to make Satine relatable, and that was something that I really shot for the first entire video until like the last like 20 minutes, because a villain needs to feel at some sense relatable. You have to have some sense of understanding with a real intimidating villain, and someone that was like truly capable of believing the way they believe, you know? I think we gave Satine somewhere to go here. I'm not gonna lie. It hurt. What I did, it hurt. It hurt a lot. I'm sorry I'm not sorry though. Yeah, anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, seek therapy.